It was meant to be a simple portrait of two siblings from 1909, a sepia-toned window into a world of stiff collars and unwavering gazes. The photograph itself was unremarkable in its composition, a standard of the era. A boy and a girl posed formally in a photographer's studio. The girl, perhaps 10 years old, sat on a high-backed velvet chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her name was Alara. The boy, her younger brother Julian, stood beside her, his small hand resting possessively on the chair's ornate arm. They were framed by a heavy damask curtain, its folds creating a deep shadowy backdrop that swallowed the light. I had acquired it as part of a small collection of family ephemera, a donation to the university's digital archives where I worked. My name is Elias Vance, and my job is to preserve these fragile ghosts, to translate their silver nitrate existence into the immortal language of pixels. The task was routine. I placed the photograph, still in its brittle cardboard mount, onto the flatbed of our high-resolution scanner. The machine whirred, its bright light passing over the faces of Alara and Julian Caldwell, capturing every fiber of the paper, every subtle gradient of the monochrome image. The initial scan appeared on my monitor, a perfect digital replica. The children stared out at me from across a century, their expression solemn, almost melancholic. It was a common look for subjects of early photography, forced into stillness for the long exposure times. Yet there was something else in their eyes, a tension that felt deeper than mere impatience. As I began the digital restoration process, cleaning away the dust and minor chemical stains that time had inflicted, I zoomed in to inspect the darker regions of the image. My focus was on the curtain behind Julian. The fabric was so dark it was almost a void, but the scanner had pulled out faint details in the texture. And that's when I saw it. At first, it was just an incongruous shape, a pale form that didn't belong. I increased the magnification, the pixels resolving into a clearer image. There, emerging from the deepest fold of the curtain just behind the boy's shoulder, was a hand. It wasn't the reassuring hand of a parent, placed on a child's back to keep them steady. It wasn't the clumsy limb of a studio assistant accidentally caught in the frame. This hand was different. It was long, pale, and skeletal, with fingers that seemed to stretch unnaturally. Its pose was not one of comfort or support. The fingers were curled around the edge of the velvet, pulling it back ever so slightly as if its owner were peering out from behind the drape. It was the hand of a hidden observer. It had been there for over 100 years, concealed in the shadows, waiting to be seen. A cold dread, sharp and illogical, prickled at the back of my neck. The children weren't just looking at the photographer. They were acutely aware of what was standing behind them. Whose hand was it, and why in God's name was it hidden? My first call was to the donor, an elderly woman named Lena Petrova. She was the great-grandniece of the children in the photograph. When I reached her, her voice was thin and reedy, layered with the static of a poor connection. I explained who I was, reminding her of her family's donation, and then I carefully described what I had found. I emailed her the magnified image as we spoke. There was a long silence on her end, punctuated by a faint, shaky intake of breath. I see it, she finally whispered. My grandmother, she never liked this picture. She said it held a draft. A draft? I asked, confused. What did she mean by that? It was something Ilara used to say, Lena explained, her voice gaining a bit of strength as she delved into memory. Ilara was my great-aunt, the girl in the chair. She told her mother, my great-grandmother, that the photo session was cold, that a cold draft kept touching the back of her brother's neck, coming from behind the big curtain. Of course, her parents dismissed it. A drafty old studio, nothing more. She told me the photograph had been taken at the renowned Croft Photography Studio in late autumn of 1909. It was intended to be a Christmas gift for their grandparents. But it became something else entirely. It became a memorial. Julian. The little boy, Lena said, her voice catching. He passed away not long after this was taken. A sudden illness, a fever that came on in the night and took him before dawn. This was one of the last pictures ever taken of him. For my great-grandmother, it was a treasure. For Alara, it was a nightmare. She refused to have it in her home, ever. The story added a layer of tragedy to the image, but it didn't explain the hand. I pressed gently, asking if there were any other details, any family stories about the photographer or the studio itself. Only that Mr. Croft, the photographer, seemed distressed when he delivered the print, Lena recalled from the stories passed down. He apparently made some comment about the difficulties of the session, about the shadows being uncooperative. My great-grandfather assumed he was just being a temperamental artist. The call ended with Lena sounding deeply unsettled, as if an old dormant fear had been reawakened. The conversation left me with more questions than answers. A cold draft, uncooperative shadows, a child's death. These were fragments, emotional debris surrounding a concrete, inexplicable fact. A pale, skeletal hand hiding in a photograph. This was no longer a simple restoration project. It was an investigation. To rule out any form of technical trickery, I sent the high-resolution scan to Dr. Isolde Finch, a former colleague and a leading expert in forensic photographic analysis. Isolde was a pragmatist, a woman who believed that every anomaly could be explained by chemistry, light, and human error. She specialized in debunking so-called spirit photography from the Victorian and Edwardian eras. If anyone could tell me this was a simple double exposure or darkroom artifact, it was her. Her initial email was dismissive. Elias, it's almost certainly a plate flaw or a clumsy attempt at a memento mori composite, though the latter is unlikely for a pre-mortem portrait. The era was rife with this sort of thing. Send me the full uncompressed file. I sent it. Her next email arrived 3 days later, and its tone was markedly different. It was terse, professional, but laced with an undercurrent of profound curiosity. Elias, it began, I've completed my initial analysis. This is not a composite image. The grain structure is consistent across the entire plate. There are no signs of masking or double exposure. The emulsion is uniform. The hand, for all its strangeness, is an authentic part of the original exposure. It was there, in the room, when the shutter opened and closed. She continued, her analysis growing more unnerving with each sentence. I've run spectral analysis on the hand itself. The light reflecting off the skin is consistent with the lighting on the children. However, the morphology is peculiar. The metacarpal and phalangeal structure suggests extreme emaciation, or a congenital condition causing arachnodactyly, unnaturally long and slender fingers. But there's more. The skin texture, where I can resolve it, lacks the normal microporosity of living tissue. It's too smooth, almost like vellum. It's not post-mortem lividity, which would present differently in a monochrome plate. It's something else. But her most disturbing discovery was not about the hand itself. There's a faint discoloration on the curtain fabric surrounding the hand, she wrote. It's a subtle marring of the velvet, almost like a heat signature or chemical bleach. It's only visible under specific light frequency filters. It forms a vague outline, the suggestion of a tall, narrow form standing behind the curtain. The hand is merely the most defined part of this disturbance. I've never seen a photographic artifact quite like it. It's as if something that was not fully in the visible spectrum left a chemical trace on the scene. I need to see the original glass plate negative, if it still exists. A chemical trace. A disturbance. The words echoed the photographer's own alleged comment about uncooperative shadows. The mystery was deepening, pulling me further into the dark folds of that studio curtain. The hand wasn't just an object in the frame, it was evidence of an event. I needed to find out what happened in Alistair Croft's studio that day. Finding the original glass plate negative after more than a century seemed like a fool's errand. but I had to try. The photographer's name, Alistair Croft, was my only lead. My research into the Croft Photography Studio led me down a rabbit hole of city directories and archived business licenses. The studio had closed its doors in the 1940s, after Alistair Croft's death. I found no record of his collection being acquired by any museum or archive. It seemed destined to be a dead end until I stumbled upon a recent local newspaper article about a historic downtown building being renovated. The article mentioned the building's history, noting it had once housed the Croft Studio, and it quoted the building's current owner, a man named Samuel Croft, Alistair's grandson. Finding Samuel Croft was easy after that. He was an architect in his late 60s who had inherited the old studio building, though he had never used it for its original purpose. When I called him and explained my research into one of his grandfather's photographs, he was intrigued. He confessed that most of Alistair's professional effects had been stored in the building's dusty, long-forgotten attic. He agreed to meet me there the following day. The attic was exactly as one might imagine, a cavern of sloping ceilings, thick with the smell of decaying paper and cedar. Dust motes danced like fairies in the single beam of light from a grimy dormer window. Stacked against one wall were dozens of wooden crates filled with glass plate negatives, each in a brittle paper sleeve. It would take a lifetime to search through them all, but in a corner, under a canvas tarp, sat a heavy wooden desk. It was Alistair Croft's old studio desk. Samuel pulled open the drawers. They were filled with invoices, supply receipts, and in the bottom drawer, a stack of leather-bound logbooks. He blew a thick layer of dust off the top one. Gilded lettering on the spine read, Croft Photography Studio, Appointments and Notes, 1908-1912. "This has to be it," Samuel said, his voice hushed with a reverence for the object. He laid the heavy book on the desk, and we carefully turned its yellowed, fragile pages. The entries were written in a precise, elegant script. Each one listed a date, a client's name, the type of portrait, and the fee paid. I gave him the names, Ilara and Julian Caldwell, and the year, 1909. Samuel ran his finger down the pages, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Ah," he said, stopping in the late autumn section. "Here they are, November 12th, 1909. Caldwell, Ilara, and Julian. Sibling portrait, silver gelatin print. Fee, $2. The entry was standard, just like all the others around it, except for one small, chilling detail. In the narrow margin next to the Caldwell entry, Alistair Croft had made an annotation. It was the only marginal note on the entire page, and it consisted of a single word, written in a cramped, hurried hand, the ink slightly smeared as if he'd written it with a trembling pen. The word was disturbance. Samuel stared at the word, his face paling in the dim attic light. "My grandfather was a man of immense precision," he said softly. "He was a chemist and an artist. He documented everything. In all the years I've glanced through his records, I've never seen a note like this. It's not a technical term. It's emotional." We stood there for a long moment, the silence of the attic pressing in around us. The single word felt like a scream trapped in a 100-year-old book. What kind of disturbance could rattle a man like Alistair Croft so thoroughly that he would feel compelled to mark his professional ledger with such a cryptic and alarming term? The logbook had confirmed that something unusual had happened, but it didn't explain what. The answer, if it existed, had to be somewhere else in this dusty tomb of memories. The discovery of the logbook entry spurred Samuel. It was no longer just my obsession, it had become his as well. The strange note was a blot on his grandfather's meticulously kept record, an anomaly that demanded an explanation. He promised to search the rest of his grandfather's belongings more thoroughly. 2 nights later, my phone rang close to midnight. It was Samuel, his voice crackling with a mixture of excitement and fear. "I found it," he said without any preamble. "I found his personal journal. He kept one his entire adult life. I found the volume for 1909. He had found the journal tucked away in a false bottom of an old steamer trunk, along with Alistair's personal correspondence and some of his early experimental photographic plates. Samuel had been up for hours, carefully reading his grandfather's looping cursive by the light of a desk lamp. He told me he had found the entry for November 12th, 1909. "You need to hear this, Elias," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. I could hear the rustle of old paper as he prepared to read. The entry was long, far more detailed than anything in his professional log. It was a raw, unfiltered account of the Caldwell portrait session, written by a man deeply shaken by what he had witnessed. Samuel began to read. November 12th, 1909. The Caldwell children came to the studio this afternoon. A handsome pair, though terribly serious. The girl, Elara, was quiet and watchful. The boy, Julian, was restless from the start. His eyes kept drifting to the large velvet backdrop behind the posing chair. He complained of being cold, though I had the stove burning brightly. His mother shushed him, attributing it to childish nerves. Samuel paused, taking a breath. "It gets stranger here, Elias." He continued reading from the journal. I arranged them for the portrait, the girl seated, the boy standing beside her. But the boy would not stay still. He kept flinching, glancing over his shoulder at the curtain. I repositioned him 3 times. On the 3rd attempt, he cried out that something had touched his hair. Mrs. Caldwell was growing impatient. I tried to reassure them all, blaming the static from the velvet or a stray thread, but I felt it too. A palpable coldness emanating from that corner of the room. Not a draft. It was a dead, heavy cold. A stillness that felt occupied. The hair on my arms stood on end. Alistair Croft had felt the same thing Elara had described. I moved behind the camera, pulling the focusing hood over my head. The world dissolved into an upside-down, monochrome image on the ground glass. As I adjusted the focus, I saw it. Through the lens, the curtain behind the boy seemed to move. It was not a sway from a breeze. It was a deliberate, slow parting of the heavy fabric, as if someone were pushing it aside from behind. My assistant, Thomas, was at my side, preparing the magnesium flash powder. No one else was in the studio. My heart began to hammer against my ribs. I should have stopped. I should have pulled the children away. But the perfect composition was there. The light was right, and Mrs. Caldwell's stern face was fixed upon me. Samuel's voice was strained now, heavy with the weight of his grandfather's century-old fear. I took the shot. The flashpan erupted with a deafening crack and a cloud of white smoke, momentarily blinding us all. The moment was over. The children were hurried into their coats, and the Caldwells were gone. The studio was silent again, and the coldness in the corner had vanished. I felt a fool, certain I had imagined it all, until I developed the plate. Here, the handwriting in the journal, Samuel noted, became jagged and almost illegible, as if Alistair had been writing in a frantic haste. In the dark room, under the safe light's crimson glow, the image slowly materialized in the chemical bath, and I saw it clearly. A hand. A pale, wretched hand, its long fingers wrapped around the curtain's edge. It was not Thomas. It was not Mr. Caldwell. It was something else. Something that had been in my studio, hidden in the shadows. I felt a terror so profound I nearly smashed the glass plate on the floor. It was an unholy thing, a stain on the image. But then I thought of the Caldwells. Mrs. Caldwell had mentioned the boy's frail health, her desire to capture his image, while he is still rosy-cheeked. I could not deny her that. I printed the photograph, using every darkroom trick I knew to burn in the shadows, to crop the frame tightly, to hide the awful visitor in the velvet. I delivered the print to them myself. I pray they never look too closely. I have wrapped the negative in black cloth and placed it in a sealed box. I never want to see it again. May God forgive me. The reading ended. The silence that followed was immense, stretching between our two homes, a bridge of shared horror. The journal was a confession. Alistair Croft had seen the hand not as a flaw, but as a visitor, and he had hidden it, burying the evidence in the shadows of his own print. "He saved the negative, Elias," Samuel said, his voice barely audible. "He wrote where he put it. It's in a small lead-lined box at the bottom of the steamer trunk. I'm looking at it right now." The existence of the original glass plate negative changed everything. It was the source code of the photograph, the physical artifact that had captured the light of that room in 1909. It held secrets the paper print could only hint at. Samuel agreed to carefully package and ship the negative to Dr. Finch's lab for analysis. The thought of that fragile pane of glass bearing its unholy image traveling across the country felt like the transportation of a sacred and dangerous relic. When Isolde Finch received the negative, she treated it with the reverence of an archaeologist unearthing a king's tomb. She handled it only in a controlled environment, examining it under high-powered microscopes and subjecting it to a battery of non-invasive tests. Her findings, when they came, were even more disturbing than her initial analysis of the scan. "The negative confirms what we suspected," she explained over a video call, her face grim. "The anomaly is embedded in the emulsion. It's not a manipulation, but seeing the source, it's revealed more. That discoloration I noted on the curtain? On the glass plate, it's not just a stain. It's a region of chemical alteration. The silver halide crystals in this specific area failed to react to light in a normal way. They're inert. It's as if something with an intense energy field, something that absorbed light and heat, was standing there, creating a shadow, not of darkness but of chemical nullity." She pulled up a microscopic image on the screen. It showed the edge of the hand against the curtain. "Look here," she said, pointing her cursor. "The skin on the back of the hand. I analyzed the texture. It shows signs of microscopic desiccation, a complete lack of moisture, consistent with mummified tissue. Yet the clarity of the image suggests it was a solid, three-dimensional object present in the room. It's a paradox. It's a photograph of something that looks both solid and ethereal, both dead and alive." The scientific language only amplified the horror. This was no ghost. Ghosts were apparitions, tricks of light. This was a physical presence that had left a chemical scar on the world. It had mass, texture, and an energy that warped the very process of photography. Armed with this new, terrifying data, I felt I had to speak with Lena Petrova one last time. It was a difficult call to make. I was no longer just a curious archivist. I was the bearer of a truth far darker than she could have imagined. I laid out everything we had discovered: the photographer's journal, the disturbance note, the forensic analysis of the negative. I told her about the chemical shadow, the desiccated skin of the hand. There was a long, ragged sigh on the other end of the line. "I wasn't entirely honest with you, Mr. Vance," she said, her voice heavy with the guilt she had carried for decades. "My family's story." I softened it. "Julian didn't just die from a fever. My grandmother told me the full story once when I was old enough not to be frightened. She made me promise never to repeat it." She took a shaky breath and continued. "The night after his parents brought the portrait home, Julian woke up screaming. He was hysterical. He told his parents that a tall, thin man had come out of the corner of his bedroom. He said the man had paper skin and cold, cold hands. He said the man had stood over his bed and watched him breathe. His father searched the house, found nothing, and assumed it was a fever-induced nightmare. They gave him a sedative to help him sleep. He never woke up. My own breath hitched in my throat. Paper skin, cold hands. And Alara," Lena went on, her voice breaking. "She was never the same. She developed a crippling phobia of curtains, of closets, of any dark enclosed space. She would have panic attacks if a door was left ajar at night. She lived to be 94, but she lived as a prisoner of that fear. She never married, never had children. It was as if a part of her had died with Julian. Then came the final piece of the puzzle, the one Lena had guarded her whole life. She told me she had Alara's childhood diary. She had found it after Alara passed away. Most of it was filled with the simple, innocent observations of a 10-year-old girl. But the entry from the day after her brother's funeral was different. It was just 3 sentences, written in a child's shaky scrawl. Lena read them to me, her voice trembling. "Julian is with the angels now. Mama says he is in a better place. But I know the truth. The man from the picture took him. His hand was so cold." The child's words struck me with the force of a physical blow. Alara had known. She had seen it too. The photograph wasn't a record of a ghost, it was a portrait of a predator. And it had captured the moment just before it claimed its prize. We were staring at the end of the road, with a collection of facts that pointed to an impossible conclusion. Isolde, ever the scientist, wanted to try one last thing. Her lab had recently acquired a new experimental imaging software designed for analyzing surface textures on ancient artifacts. It used fractal algorithms to map microscopic patterns that were invisible to the naked eye. On a hunch, she decided to run it on the high-resolution scan of the hand. The 3 of us, me, Isolde, and Samuel, gathered on a video call, watching her screen as the program worked. The algorithm scanned the back of the pale hand, translating the subtle variations in light and shadow into a topographic map of its surface. The process was slow, the image resolving pixel by agonizing pixel. For several minutes it just looked like a meaningless jumble of lines. Then a pattern began to emerge from the digital noise. It wasn't a scar, it wasn't writing. It was a symbol, etched into the desiccated skin as if branded there. It was a simple, starkly geometric shape, a perfect circle with a single, sharp vertical line drawn through its center. Samuel gasped. "I've seen that before," he said, his voice tight. "In my grandfather's things. He was interested in local folklore, old superstitions. He had books on them." While Samuel frantically searched his memory, I was already typing, my fingers flying across the keyboard, searching through online databases of historical symbols and archaic sigils. The symbol was obscure, rooted in the pre-Christian folklore of the region where the town was settled. It wasn't a ward for protection. It wasn't a hex or a curse. Its meaning was far more sinister. It was an ownership mark, an ancient sigil used in forgotten rituals to claim something, to bind it to the claimer. It was a mark of purchase. The truth crashed down on me with a suffocating weight. We had been wrong all along. The hand in the photograph was not that of a parent, an assistant, or even a restless spirit caught on film. It belonged to something that was hiding, not in the studio, but in the thin veil between worlds, using the deep shadows of the curtain as a doorway. It wasn't just peering out from behind the velvet, it was reaching through. The photograph hadn't captured a random haunting. It had captured a transaction. The entity in the shadows wasn't there by accident. It was there for Julian. The cold draft he felt, the touch on his hair, that was the assessment. The photograph was the moment it made its choice, the moment it placed its mark upon him. The portrait wasn't a final memento of a life about to be lost. It was the receipt. The most terrifying ghosts aren't the ones who have died, but the ones that have never lived at all. Discover more stories hidden in the archives by subscribing to our channel.